Imagine you are thousands of feet high in the heart of the Andes Mountains. The air is so thin it burns your lungs like acid, and the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. You are trapped inside the twisted, freezing metal carcass of a plane, surrounded by a deafening, white silence. There is no food. There is no heat. There is no hope. And then, you turn on a small, battered transistor radio, only to hear a voice crackling through the static, saying the search for your flight has been officially called off. You are dead to the world. Your parents, your friends, and your government have given up on you. But you are still breathing. This is not a horror movie. This is the true story of the 1972 Andes flight disaster. A journey into the darkest corners of the human soul, where the line between life and death completely disappears. The date was October 13, 1972. A chartered Uruguayan Air Force flight was carrying a young rugby team known as the Old Christians Club, along with their friends and family, toward Santiago, Chile. It was supposed to be a trip filled with laughter, competition, and the celebration of youth. But as they crossed the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Andes, the weather turned treacherous. Massive clouds swallowed the plane whole, blinding the pilots and creating a vortex of turbulence. Suddenly, the aircraft began to shudder violently. Before anyone could pray, the right wing clipped a hidden mountain peak, tearing the plane apart like wet paper. The fuselage, now a hollow tube of screaming passengers, slid down a steep glacier like a high-speed sled, finally slamming into a massive snowbank in the middle of nowhere. In an instant, what was a lively cabin became a graveyard of twisted metal and broken bodies. Out of the 45 people on board, several died instantly during the impact. Others were left with horrific injuries, shattered legs, punctured chests, and deep gashes, trapped in a world of ice where survival seemed statistically impossible. They were dressed in light summer blazers and cotton shirts, totally unprepared for the brutal alpine environment. They had no heavy winter clothing, no medical supplies, and only a few bars of chocolate and bottles of wine found in the wreckage. For the first few days, they held on to a thin thread of hope, scanning the horizon for a rescue plane. They made a giant cross in the snow using suitcases, but they were tiny specks in a vast, white wilderness that refused to be seen. Before we go deeper into the unthinkable choices they had to make to stay alive, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of the Past. We bring you the most haunting and incredible stories from history every week, so hit that notification bell and join our community of history seekers. As the days turned into weeks, the hunger became a physical predator living inside their stomachs. It wasn't just a craving, it was a slow, agonizing erosion of their muscles and minds. They tried to eat the leather from their luggage, the cotton stuffing from the seats, and even bits of frozen moss they found on rocks, but there was nothing to sustain life. They were starving to death in a frozen wasteland. It was then that the most harrowing conversation in human history began. They looked at the bodies of their friends and family members, preserved perfectly in the snow outside the fuselage by the sub-zero temperatures. They realized that if they didn't eat, they would die within days. The debate was agonizing and deeply spiritual. Some argued it was a mortal sin, a violation of the human soul. Others, like Nando Parado, argued that their friends would want them to live, that their bodies were now just empty shells. Eventually, out of a desperate primal will to survive, they made a sacred pact. If any of them died, the others had permission to use their bodies for food so that someone might eventually make it home to tell their story. Just when they thought they had faced the absolute worst that nature could throw at them, the mountains struck again. On the 17th night, while the survivors were huddled together for warmth inside the wreckage, a massive avalanche roared down the mountain. It buried the fuselage in seconds, filling the cabin with suffocating, heavy snow. They were trapped in a tomb within a tomb for 3 long days. They lived in total darkness, buried alive, breathing through tiny holes. They poked through the snow using a metal pole. 8 more people died in that avalanche, including some who had survived the initial crash. When they finally dug their way out, they emerged into a world that felt even more hostile than before. They were weaker, fewer in number, and the realization hit them like a physical blow. Nobody was coming to save them. They were alone on the roof of the world. The survivors knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to save themselves or die trying. 3 of the strongest survivors, Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin, began to prepare for an impossible mission. They had no climbing gear, no maps, no boots, and no experience in mountaineering. They took a sleeping bag they had painstakingly sewn together from the plane's copper wire and cabin insulation. After weeks of failed attempts and small treks, Nando and Roberto decided to make the final push. They began to climb a massive mountain peak that blocked their view to the west, believing that on the other side lay the green valleys of Chile. For days, they clawed their way up the vertical ice. They reached the summit, nearly 15,000 feet high, expecting to see a road or a town. Instead, when they reached the top, all they saw were more mountains, thousands of endless, snowy peaks, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a moment that would have broken any man. But Nando looked at Roberto and said, "We may be walking to our death, but I would rather die walking toward my family than waiting here." They kept going. For 10 days they walked, their bodies wasting away, their feet bleeding and frozen. They descended from the high peaks into deep valleys, following a small stream that eventually turned into a rushing river. The air began to get thicker. The temperature began to rise. Miraculously, the snow began to thin out, and they saw the first signs of life: small shrubs, then grass, and then the incredible sight of a cow. On the 10th day of their trek, they saw a man on horseback across a rushing mountain stream. They were so weak they couldn't even scream loud enough to be heard over the water. Nando tied a note to a rock and threw it across the river. The Chilean shepherd, Sergio Catalan, read the note, which explained they were from the fallen plane. He immediately rode for hours to find help. On December 22, 1972, 72 days after the crash, the world watched in absolute shock as helicopters lifted 16 survivors from the mountains. They were walking skeletons, bearded and hollow-eyed, but they were alive. They had survived 72 days in the most brutal conditions on Earth. When the details of how they survived by eating the flesh of the dead emerged, it sparked a global controversy. But for the survivors and their families, it was seen as a miracle of faith and friendship. They had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. This story forces us to ask ourselves, how far would you go to stay alive? What would you do if you were pushed to the very edge of human existence, where every social rule and every physical comfort was stripped away? The survivors of the Andes crash didn't just survive a plane crash. They survived the breaking of every physical and psychological limit a human being possesses. It is a story of darkness, yes, but also a story of the incredible, unbreakable light of the human spirit. It reminds us that even when the world thinks we are gone, as long as we keep walking, there is hope. If this story moved you or made you rethink what it means to be brave, please leave a comment below and tell us what part of their journey touched you the most. Was it their bravery, the difficult choices they had to make, or their refusal to give up? Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the human spirit can overcome any mountain. Thank you for watching Echoes of the Past. We'll see you in the next chapter of history. Would you like me to help you create a script for another famous survival story, or perhaps a deep dive into a different historical mystery?